Hello, welcome back to the Django Screencast. Today we're going to create some custom management commands. This was a feature that was introduced in Django Chainset 6047, so you need to make sure that you're running a recent version of the Django Subversion trunk in order to follow along. If you've read my blog at all, you know that this was a feature that I was excited about when it was initially introduced. It was then pulled back briefly while they corrected some issues and reintroduced in Chainset 6047. When we're talking about Django management commands, we're talking about the command list that we get when we type manage.py help. This list of 26 some odd commands were created by the Django core. What custom commands allow us to do is inject our own commands into that list. If you've used Django at all for any small period of time, you've used some of these commands. Generally, you'll start out with start project, which creates the initial project structure for a Django application. Quickly, you'll start to use start app, which is required in order to create an application. Well, it's not required, but it makes it easy to create an application for your project. And then often you'll use things like syncdb to synchronize the database changes in your model into your database, or reset, or some of the other commands. So by now you should have some familiarity with these commands, but if not, I'll try to cover each of the commands in depth in another podcast. There are two requirements that we must meet when we create our own custom management commands. First, we must have a specific directory structure that's created at the application level. Secondly, we must create a class that inherits from base command, which exists in Django core management base. So let's look at both of those things now. We're starting with a application here, Django application, and it's really not important what we're dealing with here in terms of the application, but we are going to add custom management commands to it. And as I stated, that the first requirement that must be met, that we must have a specific directory structure at the application level. Now when we're talking about the application level here, we're talking about, for instance in this case, delinquent is an application. It's a delicious link style application. So it must exist at this level below there, not at the project level, which in this case is screencasts. So I just want to make that clear, because if you try to create at the project level, when you type manage.py, it won't find your custom management commands. Now the structure that we're dealing with looks like the following. We'll be creating a management directory underneath the application. There'll be an init.py file. Underneath that there'll be a commands directory. Again, another init.py file underneath that. And then finally the file that will hold our command class. Now the command class itself, I guess, could potentially exist in the init.py, but we're going to go ahead and put it in the commands class. In this screenshot you see that it's called sample. We can call it generally what it's going to be called, whatever the name of the command is that we're creating. Now we could do these things here in the editor. I just prefer to do them in the console, so either way, whatever your preference is, follow along. Now if you recall, we could create the management commands in a specific application, and they do have to exist in the application level. So we could tie them to a specific application like delinquent. But we might have commands that are general purpose commands that we want to use anywhere, and in that case we can sort of follow the template tags approach that we've seen some people do, where we'll create an application that its whole purpose is just to hold sort of global commands, and then we'll use that application in multiple Django projects. So I want to take that approach because I think that's probably the approach that you'll generally take, at least for global commands. You might have application-specific ones that you would, of course, then create in a specific application. So to start with, I'm just going to use the start app command to create my application structure that's going to hold this. Now I'm just going to call this extensions, since it will hold our global extensions for our management custom management classes. And once I do that, I get an extensions directory with a couple of files in it. Now we don't need the models.py and we don't need the views.py. Now I could have just created the directory and created the init.py, obviously. But that's kind of how I approach these things sometimes. Anyway, the next thing we need to do, if you remember the screenshot, is we need to create a directory called management. And within that directory, we need to create a file called init.py, which that'll do there. And then we need to create another directory called commands. And within that structure, we need to create another file, init.py. And finally, we need to create the file that's going to hold our command class. So we'll go ahead and do that in our editor. Now we have our management directory structure here. We can see extensions, management, commands, and we don't have any file in there. So that's the first part, is creating that directory structure. The second part was creating a class that descends from base command, and base command comes from django.core.management.base. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the different commands that are available to us. There's base command, and then there's a series of other commands that descend from base command that give us specific functionality based on how our management class might be structured. So let's look at that now. First up is base command. Base command is the command from which all other commands descend. Now there are times that you would want to use base command, but if possible you want to use another command that descends from base command that more appropriately reflects the structure of what you're trying to do in your custom management command. Now with base command, we need to make sure that we implement the handle method. So that's the method that we would override in order to implement something that descends from base command. An example of some of the commands that are built into Django that use base command are load data, dump data, run server, and test. Next is noargs command, and as its name indicates, it's a command that descends from base command but that accepts no arguments. The validation of not accepting arguments will occur automatically, and so if you have a custom management command that doesn't accept any arguments, then you're going to want to just send your custom command from the noargs command class. As I stated, it's a custom command that doesn't accept any arguments. And in the noargs command class, you must implement the handle_noargs method. Some examples of that would be shell. If you think about it, it makes sense, right? When you do .manage.py shell, there are no arguments that you're really providing that command. Of course, db shell, diff settings, inspect db, flush, and so forth. We also have a label command. A label command is a command that accepts a specific label, but it's not validated against anything such as a model or a app or something like that. So it's required that it has this label, but not necessarily validated in something within your application. The label command is used quite often. As I said, it's a command that accepts a label, and in its case you must implement the handle label method. Some examples of commands that are built into Django that implement the label command class are start app, start project, and create cache table. Now, when we look at the next command, you might think, well, why doesn't start app use the app command, which is the next one we'll look at? Well, the reason is because at that point the app doesn't exist, because that's what the start app command is doing, is creating that app, and so therefore there's nothing to validate against. So start app and start project both use the label command. And as I said, app command would be the next one. And this is the one that's used most commonly with the commands that are built into Django. And it's a command that accepts an application name as an option. So the application name gets validated automatically, and when it gets passed into the handle app method, which you must implement, you're actually getting a reference to that application module, not just the name. Some examples of commands that use this within Django are the admin index, SQL, and I'm talking about all the variants of the SQL command, like SQL reset, SQL indexes, and so forth. And then also like the reset, which I use quite frequently. So that's sort of an overview of the different commands. We've got base command, noargs command, label command, and app command. Now you can create your own specific commands off of that if you want, or you can use one of those and just implement it accordingly. Now, before we jump into creating our own command class, what I want to do is just talk about briefly a couple of command attributes that are that you can kind of turn on and off within your command class. The first one is the requires model validation. If this is true, models are validated before the command is executed. So if you think of the case of syncdb, for instance, the models get validated before that syncdb happens. But if you're doing something that doesn't really require model validation, then you might want to set this to false, just so that the command can run even if models are not validated at that point in time. Another attribute is the output transaction attribute. The output transaction attribute wraps SQL statements in begin and commit statements. Now this affects not only the output of those SQL statements if the SQL statements are printed to the console, but it also affects, in the case of like syncdb, which says is the true, the executed SQL statements against the database. So obviously in that case you'd want it to be true so that all of the changes are made against the database or none of them are made. We don't end up in this kind of weird state. Finally, we have an attribute called can import settings. This attribute is only used if we can assume the import of the settings module. We're talking about the settings.py module. If it's available, then generally we want to set this to true. The one case where we see this not set to true, obviously, is in the start project command, which creates the settings.py file, so it's not available at the time that that command gets executed, and so therefore it would need to be set to false. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, let's create our command class. I'm going to go ahead and create a new file, and I'm going to just call this say hello. And we're going to create something very simple to begin with, just so that we can understand the structure of what we're doing without complicating things too much. Now, as I stated, this class must descend from base command or some derivative of that. In this class, in this case, just to keep things simple, we're going to create a command that descends from noargs command. In other words, a command that doesn't have any arguments. So to begin with, I'm going to start with from Django core management base. I'm going to import the noargs command class. We're going to create our own class called command that descends from noargs command. All right, that should be pretty straightforward. Now, as I stated, there are a few attributes that we can use to specify how our command should operate with the environment that we're dealing with. And so we're going to go ahead and set a couple of those. First is the requires, can't spell today, requires model validation. And we're going to set that to false. Because in this case, this command is actually just going to say hello to us. So when we type it, it's going to output something to the console that says hello. So we certainly don't need model validation for that to occur. Secondly, the can't import settings, I'm going to go ahead and set that to true. That just means that the settings file does exist at the time that we're running the command. We could assume that's true. Now, if you remember from our slides, we said that the noargs command must implement the handle noargs method. So we're going to do that now. And it will accept a set of options. Now, it might be a good time for me to say this now, is that the options are different from arguments. So this is a noargs command. That means it doesn't accept any arguments, but it can accept options. Let me show you what we're talking about. Back here, our command line, we'll go back to there. When we type manage.py help, and let me just use something like reset. Notice that reset accepts a set of options. In fact, all the commands set a set of options, regardless of the number of arguments they accept. The options are this stuff down here. Specification of the settings file, the Python path, and then you can declare your own options, which we'll do in the next command that we create, just to show you how that's done. So for instance, with our command, we can have manage.py say hello. I cannot accept an argument, which might be blah, but it can accept options, which might be dash dash settings equal whatever. So hopefully that's clear what the difference between those two things are. So in this case, we're just going to print hello world, right? Real original, right? So there we go. We've created our command, and we've implemented the handle noargs method, and we did something with that. So let's see if this works. We'll go back to the command line, and first let's just see if it appears in the list of commands that are available. So we type manage.py help, and if you notice, say hello, it's right there. So it is there. So we've certainly done something right. Let's go ahead and execute the command. And there it is, hello world. So we've created our first custom command. Now obviously it's not very interesting, but I want to show you one other thing. If we type manage help and then the command name, we get specific help for that command. So in this case, it gives us the usage, which is manage.py, say hello, and then any options. And we get the default options that come with any base command. But there's some more that we can do with this. One particular attribute that we can set is an attribute called help. And if we provide an attribute called help, we might in this case say runs a shell output that writes hello world to the console. Put whatever you want there. Now when we go back and we type help say hello again, we get that little help description that we just typed in. Runs a shell output that writes hello world to the console. So that's something that you want to do to provide a little bit more feedback to your users. Yeah, if you have external or third-party users or whatever that might be using your command, that's a helpful thing to provide. Now there's a couple other attributes that we can set to provide information into this help screen. And we'll get to that when we get to our next command. So let's do that now. Now we're going to do something a little bit more exciting this time. Not much, but we're going to create a say hello command, custom command, that allows us to pass in as an argument our name. So if we say hello name Michael, it will reply back hello Michael. Now when we remember the different types of commands that we could descend from, obviously we can't use a noargs command because at this point we're going to be passing in an argument which would be the name of the person that we're going to say hello to. So our options are a label command or an app command or a base command if we're doing something sort of weird and we just want to kind of start from a bare bones point. Since we're not dealing with an application name, we'll just use a label command in this case, and this will allow us to see a different implementation of a custom management command. So to start off, we'll create a new file. I'm going to say hello name, and again we must descend from Django core management base. I'm going to import the label command this time. We're going to create our class called command that will descend from a label command. Now, being a good citizen, we'll create some help. It runs a shell output that writes out hello and the specified name. We're going to go ahead and set requires model validation to false and can import settings to true, just like we did last time. Make these a little nicer. Now in this case, with the label command, we must implement the handle label method. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. It's a little different in that it accepts self and then a label, which we can call whatever. I'm just going to call it name. And then our options. So if you're curious about the parameters that are required, take a look at the Django core management base module and you'll see the different handle methods and the parameters that are required for that. I'm also planning to create a cheat sheet when I get a chance that sort of has all this stuff spelled out. So in this case, what we want to do is just print hello and the name that was passed in. right? So nothing real interesting. So let's see if that works fine. We'll go back to our console, type manage, and I'm going to do help just to see if it's there. And sure enough, say hello name is there. So I'm going to do manage, say hello name, and pass in Michael, and it outputs hello Michael. Now if we don't pass any parameter in, remember this is the label command, so it does the validation for us. It tells us enter at least one label. Now enter at least one label is not real descriptive for our command. I mean, we would rather it say enter at least one name or person's name or something like that. So let's look at how we can do that. There are a couple other attributes in addition to the help attribute. One of the attributes is args, where we can define the arguments that we expect and how they will appear in the help command name screen within the console. So in this case, our argument is a name. I mean, that's what we're dealing with. We can also have an attribute called label. And the label attribute describes what the argument is. So in this case, we might say person's name. Okay? Let's go back to the console, and this time let's not pass in an argument, and we get a more descriptive error message that says enter at least one person's name, and that comes from that label attribute. Also notice if we type the help for this command, we get the description that we saw before, but we also get name up here. Now if we didn't provide an args attribute, this would just say label. So in this case, this is more descriptive where it says name, so the user knows what we're talking about as far as passing in a name. Now on the last command I mentioned about the options, that the options were different from the arguments, and that we could provide our own options in addition to the base options that are provided with base command. So let's take a look at what it takes to do that. We're going to go back, and what we wanted to do is add to the options that are provided with the label command. So first I need to import the make option method. That's an opt parse. Now within this class, I'm going to add to the option list to the one that's built into the label command. All right. Whoops. I'm going to use make option. And let's say, for instance, we wanted to have an option that allowed the user to pass in an option that said capitalize it or don't capitalize, whatever the name is. It's sort of a fictitious thing, but I think it helps illustrate the point. So we can have an option called capitalize. We can also provide a small version of that option, which would be just the -c, for instance. And then we can have an action. In this case, it's a Boolean, so we're going to store true. And if you're not familiar with the make option method, you can look it up online. I'll try to remember to provide a link in the show notes to show you where you can get more information on that. But anyway, the action is store true, and then the destination is going to be capitalize. And this will be the actual option name that it's going to get stored in. All right. We can also provide some help text on top of that. So if we want to do that, we just provide some help text. It says, tells Django to capitalize the name. All right, so that's sort of a mouthful. I'm going to kind of go over it again. What we have here is we're adding to the option list. Option list is right here. And we're taking the label command option list, and we're going to create a new option called capitalize. And we can provide a short version or not. That's what this -c is for. So either the user can provide -c or -- capitalize, either way. The action when it's set is going to be store true. Since it's a Boolean, that will store true if it's set into the destination of capitalize. And then we provide some help text to that option, which is just tells Django to capitalize the name. Once we have that, we can use that down here, and we can say if options.get capitalize. Remember, that's the name we gave it in the destination above. False. And we're going to say name equals name dot capitalize. So we're just going to use the capitalize string method. So this basically says if the option for capitalize is true, this false is a default, then the name is equal to the name capitalize. And then finally, we just print the name. All right, let's give that a try. We can look at the help here, and you notice that we now have this option -c -- capitalize tells Django to capitalize the name. So it's part of our options. We're going to pass in the name without capitalizing it, and it's not capitalized. And then I'm going to pass in the name with the -c. Notice it's capitalized. Or we can also do -- capitalize. Whoops. Looks like I must have spelt it wrong over here. Yep. There we go. So now you can see that everything works. We're able to provide arguments and options, and we're able to create sort of a somewhat more complex command, although it's not really doing much, but the implementation of the command is, whatever you want it to be. Now, although we've kind of covered everything there is to cover in terms of creating your own custom command, I did want to show you a more real-world example. Now, if you've read my blog, you know that I don't like creating form definitions for models. Now, a lot of people use form for model, and I wanted something that would create that form definition for me, so I created a method called describe form, where I could pass it in the name of model and it would automatically describe that form as a form definition to the console. Now, this is something that would be useful to have as part of a global management command structure that I could use whenever I need it. So let's go ahead and create that now. What we're going to do is add a new command. So I'll say new file here. And it's going to be called describe form. And I've already got it on the clipboard. So there it is. Now in this case, once again, we've used the label command is what we're descending from, because we're going to describe form and we're going to pass in the name of a model. Now we have an app command which validates against an app, and I suppose we could have implemented describe form in such a way that it would print out form definitions for every model within an app. But I really just wanted a specific model. And so I used the label command to pass in that model name. And it's actually going to be structured in such a way that you pass in the app.model name. And then we've got the implementation of describe form down here. And the details of that aren't really that important, but just for you to be able to see a real-world example. So once we have that in place, we can go back to our console, type manage, help, just to make sure it's there, and we can see that describe form is right there. And so I'm going to pass in manage, describe form, and then the application.model name. Now in this app, I'll just show you, I told you that we have this application called delinquent, and for its models we have a model called link. This is sort of a delicious type thing that we're going to work with in some future screencasts, so we're just working with it now. And so it's going to be delinquent.link. And when we get done, we get a form definition from Django import new forms as forms and so forth. We get the link form, and we get all the fields with the correct form definition for us. And we can copy and paste that into a new file, and we're good to go. Now one final thing. While I was creating the screencast, I started thinking about, wouldn't it be nice if we had a custom management command that created this custom management command structure for us and kind of just put all the right things in the right places and just made it easy to get started with creating custom management commands. So I went ahead and did that, and I created a custom management command called create command. And this will be available in the downloads for the screencast. And if you notice that this command descends from app command, and it has a couple of options available. One of the options is --name, which is the name of your command, and the other option is the --base, or the base command upon which your command will be descended upon. This can be used multiple times to create multiple commands within an existing structure, or to create the structure initially if you don't have a structure in place. And I'm just going to show you how this works. We have this application structure here called delinquent, and we're going to go ahead and create our own command structure within that. So first off, let's just look at the help for create command. Create command, we're going to pass in an app name, and we also have a couple of options, as I stated. One called -n command name, which is the name of the management command that we're going to use, and -b base command, which is the name of the base command, which will be one of base, app, label, or noargs. All right. So we should be able to use that with create command. App name is going to be delinquent. We're going to use -b. It's a base command. Let's just say we're going to use label command. It doesn't matter at this point because we're not going to really create anything. And -n for the name of the command, and let's just say test command. All right. When we do that, we get back to here. Let's go back to TextMate, and we notice that within delinquent we have this structure called the structure management with the init.py commands, init.py again, and then also a test command which descends from a label command, and it's got all the right things. It even does the handle label, and of course we're raising and not implemented. So you would just put your code in here and you're ready to go. If you wanted to create an additional command in that same structure, we could just use the same, we can call noargs, let's say. and another test. And when we go back, we'll have this new file, another test, which descends from noargs, and it handles the noargs command method. So anyway, that's just an example of how we can use this for the purpose of code generation to make our jobs easier, or for other things like some of the commands that are built into Django. So I encourage you to take some of the little tips and tidbits that you have and try to wrap them into commands, and maybe make a repository and make that available to other people so that they can benefit from that as well. Thank you again, and I hope to see you next time at the next Django Screencast.